Hi, my name is Brianna Puckett, and my bioethics group decided to choose the topic Better Birth Pre-Implantation Genetic Diagnosis. And the question that we were faced with was, is it morally permissible for Naoko and her husband to do PGD, which means Pre-Implantation Genetic Diagnosis? Our case study said that a 22-year-old Japanese woman, Naoko, is known to carry DNA that causes Huntington's disease, which is a disease that has no cure. Typically, symptoms which include peculiar behaviors and limb movement start between 30 to 50 years of age, but can appear as early as 2 and as late as 80 years old. It is progressive and eventually affects the mind, causing inevitable death after 15 to 20 years. Huntington's disease is caused by a dominant mutation, so an individual can get the disease when only receiving a single mutated copy of the DNA. Naoko has a 50% chance of passing this DNA on to each of her children. The symptom of the disease can vary mild to severe depending on the person. Some live short lives and others live rather long lives. Having experienced a stillbirth 1 year before, at which time she discovered her mutated DNA, and grieving the loss of her baby girl, Naoko and her husband desperately want to have another child that has a good chance of being healthy. They are considering trying pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to have another child. And the biblical ethical position that we have on this case is no, it is not acceptable in general, but would be acceptable under certain situations, such as to prevent a genetic mutation in an embryo. And the biblically derived principles that we found that go along with our case are the Shepherd King principle, which talks about meeting the needs of the creation. And the quote that we found from that is, it says, "As we serve our subjects, we are to look out for the best interests of all that is placed under us, which is the entire creation. The Shepherd King meets the needs of his subjects. We are to protect anything in the creation that needs our protection, cure those things that need curing, and provide for those things that need food and water." And another principle that we found that goes along with our case is their creation normative principle, which talks about how to restore the negative effects of the fall of man. And the quote that we found says, "Humans have been authorized to reverse the negative effects of the curse. As a result, we are justified minimizing degeneration, curing diseases, and relieving suffering." And the Christian perspective that we have on this case, and the references that we used are, one of them is the Appendix Manifesto on Biotech. Human Dignity Resource, Colson states, "We strongly favor work on biotechnology that will lead to cure for diseases and disabilities, and we are excited by the promise of stem cells from adult donors and other ethical avenues of research." And another reference that we found was Conclusion Towards a Foundation of Biotechnology, and it says, "As all human beings, regardless of age or level of development, health, disability, or status, are God's images. Each is worthy of respect and protection." And those basically just talk about how everything is made in the image of God, and we as humans are called to protect what God has given us and given us authority over. And and then a biblical worldview assumptions that we answered are, the questions are, what is prime reality, the ultimate or foundation reality? And we answer that by saying prime reality is that God is an infinite, all-powerful, relational God who reveals himself to us through Scripture. And what is the nature of external reality, the world around us? And external reality is God's creation. He is responsible for the creation of the universe and all of the laws that govern it. And another question is, what is being human? And we answered that in the biblical worldview, a human being is one of God's image bearers. This means all people who are made in the image of God and have qualities specific to each other. And another question is, what happens to a person after death? And we answer that by saying, upon death, a person will either live with God eternally or be separated from eternally. And another question is, why is it possible to know anything at all? Anything that a person learns or knows ultimately comes from God. He gives us the ability to gain knowledge. And another thing is, how do we know what is right and wrong? And we know right and wrong from God. He has given that privilege to us. And Christians are to strive to be like Jesus, who lived a perfect life. Jesus was sinless, and we are to strive to be like him. And what is the meaning of human history? And human history is merely a sequence of events. In the biblical worldview, this sequence of evidence are used to carry out God's purpose for man. And what life commitments are consistent with these beliefs? And Christians are called to serve God and commit their lives to God. And that's just as we are called as Christians. We are to just strive to be with God and to just have that relationship with him. And the secular perspective is there is nothing to ground sameness. This is why many physicalists reject a robust view of personal identity. For many physicalists, when an entity includes a person construed materialistically, loses some part and gain new ones, it literally becomes a different entity. But a person maintains his or her personal identity even though body parts are lost, even though a person will get a new set of cells approximately every 7 years. And we found that in Worldview of Naturalism reference. And another thing that we found is, according to the moral status of embryos, in addition to physical resemblance, Strong adds that potentiality of self-consciousness, sentences, viability, and birth are likewise morally relevant similarities to those possessed by normal adult beings. And how do you answer those questions that I asked in the Christian worldview assumptions? How does the secular worldview approach those questions? And again, the first question was, what is prime reality, the ultimate foundation of reality? And the secular worldview views it as prime reality consists of matter that is existent forever, and all that is has existed. And this view does not believe God exists and pushes the idea of the cosmos. And another question is, what is the nature of external reality? What is the world around us? And external reality appears in two forms of human beings, subjective and objective. And this perspective believes that the universe is made only of matter. And another question is, what is a human being? And from the secular perspective, humans are complex, and their personalities are just related through chemicals. Since this view does not believe that God exists, there is no creator. So man and the world around us, nothing was created by someone. They just either happened, or over time they grew more and more complex. And another question that we're faced with is, what happens to a person at death? And the secular view believes that death is the end. Death is the end of personality and individuality. There is nothing beyond death. There is nothing beyond this physical world. The physical world is it. And how is it possible to know anything at all? And from the secular worldview, we have the ability to learn and know things because it's just in us. And another question that we are faced with was, what is right and wrong? How do we know right and wrong? And from this perspective, the foundation of morality is non-existent. It is solely based on their subjective opinion. So what I think is right and what I think is wrong is different than, the person sitting next to me in class view of what is right and wrong. And that's how the secular worldview approaches the question of how do we know what is right and wrong, is individuals have their own opinion. And another question is, what is the meaning of human history? And human history is just random events that happened at different times, and that is exactly what the perspective believes. There is no rhythm or reason as to why things happened. They just happened, and there's no reason behind those things. And what life commitments are consistent with these beliefs? And from a secular worldview, there are no commitments. this worldview doesn't have purpose behind their actions. It's almost like they think that the world just happened and that they just happened, and then there's no meaning for them, and they're just going to live life the way that they want, because if they think it's right, they'll do it, because that to them is right and not wrong. And there's nothing after death, so they're just going to live life to the fullest. And my personal view to this whole case of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is that I believe that it is morally permissible for the family to do a PGD, because they are trying to prevent a deadly disease later in the embryo's life. And if they were doing it to enhance features of the embryo, I do not think that it would be permissible, because as a Christian, God has created us as an image of God and of himself. So if we were to enhance features that he has not given us, it's almost as though we are saying that the characteristics that God has given us is not good enough. And another person in my group says that she believes that it is permissible for this couple to do a PGD, only because they are doing this to prevent a disease and ensure that the baby has the best life possible. If the couple was trying to change certain features of the baby, PGD would not be permissible in her opinion. And another girl says that in her opinion, the decision of doing PGD would be acceptable in this case. The family is taking measures solely to prevent a deadly disease in the child, which I believe is morally acceptable. However, if the only intentions of this PGD was to produce desirable traits in the embryo, then the testing should not be performed. And another girl says that she believes this family should do a PGD. The family is trying to prevent the embryo from having a disease. However, if the family decides to do something else to change the embryo, then it is not morally permissible. So as a whole, our whole group decided that any time that people try and do a PGD to enhance features of somebody, as saying, I want them to be tall or I want them to be athletic, that is not permissible. But if they are doing a PGD to prevent a lifelong disease that is eventually just going to be deadly and harmful for that person, if they are able to prevent that, that is permissible, because they are trying to prevent the suffering of someone else. And I believe that if they were going to have an abortion, if they were to find out that, the embryo does have the disease, I do not think, and most of the girls in my group did not think, that it is permissible for them to follow through with an abortion, because it is murder, and by killing some baby just because, it has a disease, is not permissible. And so that all is just our presentation, and it has really opened all of our eyes into just realizing, this is something that people have to struggle with, is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, is it morally correct? And we all answered that by saying that yes, it is permissible in that instance, but not in general, because a lot of people do try and use it to create features and enhance features in an embryo. But overall, I hope that will give you guys an idea of what pre-implantation diagnosis really is. Thank you.